Welcome back, 352. So here's the thing. There's big news from the federal Liberals today, at least as far as it concerns Mark Carney, former governor, of course, of the Bank of Canada. Colton Praill, CTV News Ottawa correspondent, on the line. So this, I don't know if you call this a pretty big get or not, but I think clearly people remember Mark Carney.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something where we've been wondering what Carney and the Liberals are going to do for a long time. The summer has been full of theorization. Is the cabinet role? Is he gunning for top job and stepping in for Trudeau? In the case of an election, where would he land? And we finally have an answer, and it's chair of a leaders' task force on economic growth. What's interesting is it's a role not in the Prime Minister's office or in the Privy Council office, but with the Liberal Party of Canada, still advising Trudeau, but in his role as leader of that party, and focused more on policy and suggestions as far as not just short-term economic growth, but long-term economic growth. And I think that's really interesting because we know that affordability is the biggest issue right now for Canadians. But what is another issue that is quickly picking up steam is unemployment and jobs. And we've heard the conversation around productivity being an issue in Canada. 6 out of the last 7 quarters, it's dropped. We're seeing the rising unemployment rate. The reason that inflation is improving is because that unemployment rate is getting worse. And so, I think we're going to see a shift in Canadians relatively soon, going from worrying about affordability to also worrying about their job security. And so if Carney can help the Liberals come up with some economic policies that speak directly to that show a clear, concise plan for here's not only how we're going to solve the affordability crisis of today, but actually improve Canada's economy for the future and ensure that you see wage growth and increase productivity and go back to being, among the leaders in the G7 and G20 on that. That could be a really strong answer to one of the greatest criticisms they've faced from the Conservative government, which is that they're out of touch and they don't get the financial struggles that most Canadians are going through right now. That's at least the overarching plan. Whether they can do that or not remains to be seen. But, to your point, is getting Mark Carney a good get? Well, it's certainly always helpful to have advice from someone who is the governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, because it seems to me a while ago when things started turning, sour for the federal Liberals, Mark Carney's name came up as a possible successor to Justin Trudeau.
There were a lot of rumors swirling around Ottawa, not only that he would do that, but as far as which seat he would take. He was in, neighborhood conversations in Ottawa Vanier, which is a incredibly safe Liberal seat currently held by Mona Fortier, who says she plans to run in the next election. So don't read too far into that. But the rumors were there. There was nothing concrete, but certainly it was conversations. The big questions weren't necessarily could Carney do it? Would he have Liberal support? But would Carney do it? Is it the right move? He's been, we know the Prime Minister has said he's tried to convince Carney to step into federal politics for several years now. We also know he's informally at least advised the Prime Minister before. If you look back to 2020 and the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, Carney was giving the Prime Minister informal advice around how to generate an economic plan to bounce back from that pandemic. And I think if you look at the way that Canada responded, certainly compared to a number of our peers, we actually weathered that a little better than most. Now, was it perfect? Maybe not. But clearly he's had influential roles in the past, and it's interesting to see him joining now from the sidelines. One of the ways I've seen this described is they're not married, but they're living together at this point.
By the way, I should mention I read the piece. I see the Conservatives are quite impressed by his appointment, huh?
Yeah, this wasn't a surprise. I mean, they've been calling him carbon tax Carney even prior to this. It's been coming up in meetings. I think behind the scenes, Conservatives have been salivating at this style appointment, especially if it could have come in the form of cabinet or leader, because they're very eager and quick to paint Carney in the same light as Trudeau. You saw Andrew Scheer do it in his press conference today. As soon as it was reported, yes, carbon tax Carney came out, but the next thing he said was he is another liberal elite. He's just like Justin Trudeau. He's in favor of all of the same economic policies like the carbon tax policies that are costing you money. He doesn't get your struggles. He is not in the same class. And so the attacks against Carney aren't surprising. They're going to be in that same manner. And I don't think we've seen the last of them. This is just going to be ramping up.
Let me move on to talk about the other story today. Federal workers now back to the office. So they're on a 3-day week. This is the first day back today from their 2-day week, this hybrid situation set up by the government. And from what I'm reading, not everyone's in love with this idea. I read the unions are still thinking of protesting. They're not necessarily taking this as a fait accompli.
Yeah, we've seen rallies carry on. I mean, this is going into federal courts, it's worth mentioning. Last week, a federal judge said there would be a hearing on this, and really it all comes down to, if you remember that national strike last year, the unions were really upset about a return to office and wanted some clarity around remote work and hybrid work, and they didn't get it in the new CBA. They didn't get it in that new collective bargaining agreement. And you fast forward a year later to May of 2024, and this directive comes down, adding an extra minimum day in office for these workers. And obviously there's frustration, as I think anybody who is a hybrid or remote worker who suddenly has to go into the office is going to feel that frustration and that sentiment. But they're challenging this in court, asking the federal government to prove why it's necessary. They're calling it unreasonable. They say they have data that productivity was actually up during the pandemic. The feds counter and say they feel like the overall performance has dropped with remote and hybrid work. Neither one really has, or at least has shown, significant evidence for either of those claims, but ultimately what this could come down to in courts isn't whether or not productivity is up or down, but whether the federal government as an employer has the right to dictate the terms of employment and where and when you work are those terms. We could see a situation where productivity actually is up, but people still end up going back to the office. By
the way, the grumblings, I guess, continue today, right? I read someone saying they used to commute to work and now they're going to have to go back to what, basically taking their cars to work. They used to take public transit and now will have to take their cars back to work. That's how bad it's gotten in Ottawa?
Well, that's the other aspect of this. We're talking about 282,000 or so employees, but about 130 of those are in the National Capital Region. And public transit in Ottawa has taken a nosedive. If you don't work Monday to Friday, between the hours of 7:30 a.m. and 6 p.m., the LRT service has moved from every 5 minutes to every 10 minutes. Bus service has been severely restricted. We're seeing much more infrequent service, much longer trips. There's already been an issue with reliability, especially when it comes to buses that are supposed to come every 30 minutes, not showing up at all. And so, this has been a problem for employees across the city of Ottawa, but it's certainly going to be a problem that you see thrust back into the spotlight when all of a sudden you have 130,000 people, many of whom are jumping on transit back into the downtown core.
And we thought things were bad in Montreal. Hey, Colton, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Anytime.
Colton Praill, CTV News Ottawa correspondent. So there you go. Mark Carney joining the Liberals as a special advisor. And federal workers all back today for that extra day of work. That would include people, of course, here working for the federal government. 4 o'clock. Jason's coming up with your news. James Menny's next on the other side.